So, am I close enough to the mic?
A little closer.
Not really. There are no buttons.
So another option would be to use a hand.
Okay. No, I'll just lean forward.
Yeah.
That better?
Yes.
Okay. So, I wear a lot of hats, which I think probably why Kevin asked me to come here. I'm an architect and a planner. I'm a developer, property manager, a builder. I'm president of a special improvement district in Rahway, and I've lived here in Princeton since 1980. So I hear about these issues primarily in Princeton as a resident. I wanted to talk about parking from the perspective of a developer primarily. And I'm going to use several projects I've worked on over the last 20 years to illustrate some principles that relate to the provision, design and provision of parking in the context of new development. Different set of issues than what Kevin was talking about. And in thinking about the issues in Princeton, I thought that two.
Joe, can you lean a little closer
Yes.
to the mic? It's
Yes,
not very
I
loud.
can.
Sorry.
Two useful constructs in thinking about this are what was in the mind of the decision makers and the designers at the time and in that place when these decisions were being made, which requires sort of not the same as going to a community and seeing how it looks and feels today. So one set of issues is what were they trying to deal with? The other issue is going there today being completely ignorant or oblivious or not really caring what they were trying to do, but just looking at the physical facts that are there on the ground and thinking, well, what takeaways are there? What ideas are there in this that are helpful or useful in my community in terms of the problems I'm trying to solve today? So the first project I wanted to show you is in Metuchen. It was designed in the late 90s, constructed a few years later. It's about 2 blocks from the center of downtown Metuchen. It's a project of 2-story apartment buildings. It's once the site of a elementary school built about 100 years ago. Couldn't be saved or repurposed because it had extensive asbestos contamination, and so it was slated for redevelopment by the borough. It was a project actually initiated by the borough of Metuchen. So, noteworthy for a couple of things at the outset. Very large site for an in-town redevelopment, almost a 6-acre site, 2 blocks from the center of town. It's also an affordable housing site, and one of the challenges in this project was to include housing. The developer had an internal criteria that wanted the affordable housing to be completely invisible. So if you walk through the community, you couldn't tell what was affordable and what was market rate. And there's your cheater sheet. The lighter colored boxes are the affordable housing. So I'm going to walk through what this community looks like and then talk a bit about the parking issues. A number of criteria that were imposed on the project, some from the borough of Metuchen, which had very clear ideas about what it wanted to achieve, and a number of criteria that were internal to the developer. One was both the developer and the borough wanted to get as much parking on-street, in the form of on-street parallel parking, and try to get as much of that as possible, and to avoid the extensive use of parking lots. Another was, since inevitably you couldn't get all the parking on-street, to the extent to which the parking lots were needed to disperse them around the community so there wouldn't be visual impact of large parking lots. Third was to the extent that there were parking lots and they were scattered around a site, to minimize their impact on the public space. And third, where parking was going to occur, even in a parking lot or on street in large concentrations, to find some ways to either mitigate it, re-reference it, so that it didn't necessarily look like a large parking field.
There's a stairway leading into every house?
Yes, this was,
Handicapped accessible?
this
That's
project,
not required?
this project was one of the last projects.
But you could smuggle through without?
It was the last project that I personally worked on that was not subject to barrier-free requirements in multifamily housing. So that, yes, so at that time, every single unit had a front porch. It's a fascinating issue. I would love to talk about it another time. This is a really important design issue in terms of urban design, in terms of accessibility, how to deal with that, but for another time, another place. But every single unit has a front porch. Yes.
Did the Mount Laurel decision include parking spaces for each affordable unit?
Yes. Every the parking requirement in this project was applied across the board. There were 105 housing units, of which 15 were affordable. And parking requirement we backed into was just under 2 spaces per unit. It was actually 1.92. And that was applied across the board. So this is a view of Nassau Street, about 20 miles north of here, looking south on Route 27. And one of the issues in this project was that the site was bounded by 3 streets. One was a state highway, like this. This is Route 27. Another was a county road. Both of those had very, very heavy traffic. And so there was a need to, let me back up. In most places, we're used to, in Princeton, the idea that a state highway running through the center of town has on-street parking. That happens almost nowhere along Route 27 except in Princeton and Highland Park. In this community and in this project, because there was a need, there was so much road frontage, which we didn't want to abandon to high-speed travel without the mitigation and buffering of on-street parallel parking, we were determined to find a way to park cars on Route 27. And we'll talk about this in a little more detail. This is what Route 27 looked like right after the project was open. This is what it looked like a few years later as the trees began to mature, and that's what it looks like now. All taken at the same view. It was an interesting, one of the things that's from a developer's point of view, since form inevitably follows parking in the design of any kind of multifamily housing community, the parking and other aspects of the design are linked in many, many ways. So for example, on this site, we had this need to create parking on a very busy road. We had to solve the problem of you couldn't just stop traffic when there's 30,000 cars a day going by to allow someone to parallel park and back into spaces. So we developed strategies to make it easier both for people to park, parallel park back in and pull out, and also to convince the regulators in the county and the state that it would result in a whole bunch of cars being hit. At the same time, there's also the need, since we're putting housing in a downtown area in which large suburban setbacks are inappropriate. So the question is, how do you get all this housing so close to the parked cars and the busy road and still make it work for everybody? So all those things inevitably are linked together. And in Princeton, when we try to figure out what to do with future provision of parking, as opposed to the management of it, it's essential to address all these pieces and get a clear picture of how they all fit together. So the community was designed very much around the idea of parking. And one of the design strategies that was developed was to maximize the amount of streets running through the community. The reason to do that was that the more streets you have, the more frontage you have. From a developer's point of view and from an urbanist's point of view, frontage is a good thing. Many developers like to have as little street as possible because streets cost money to build. Many municipalities like to have as few streets as possible because streets cost money to maintain. But from the point of view of parking as a utility, The more streets you have, the more cars you can park on.
Are
And-
these through streets, or are they streets that basically have a termination?
I'm gonna back up and look at the
I
site plan.
forget, I didn't look at that on the picture.
Keep an eye on curves, turns.
So,
Okay, so they could be through streets.
yes, I'm gonna grab my little magic pointer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the streets all go through, but they don't go through in obvious direct ways. And so the intention is to balance those two things, to have traffic that can go through, so that you get the advantages of an urban grid, that people can get from point A to point B, but they don't get there necessarily really fast. So this is Route 27. This is a county road, also huge amounts of traffic, 4 moving lanes of traffic on this. It's actually a lot busier than Route 27 is in Princeton, and that's a local street.
Are there traffic lights on the,
There's a traffic light.
major road?
There's a traffic light here.
so there's a temptation to cut through to avoid the traffic light?
There's no temptation to do that.
No
because-
temptation?
Right, because it's pretty circuitous to do that. You have to do all that different amount of stuff.
Mhm.
And the amount, it's just about the same amount of time to wait for the light. And most people who are driving through, who don't know the community, probably don't know those routes. You could do this, Metuchen is sort of like Princeton in that the street layout is a grid. And so if you happen to know your way through town, you can navigate all sorts of ways. But the idea here was to create as much road frontage as possible. So that because every single street was made with parallel parking on both sides of every street. The net result was about half the parking was provided on street and half the parking was provided in parking lots. The magic of reducing the parking requirement that needed to be serviced in parking lots to half was such that you only needed 5 relatively small parking lots to accommodate the rest of the parking. Another advantage is that virtually everyone who lives here, the parking spaces on street are not designated. Everyone who lives here can pretty much park in front of their house. You may not be able to park. Thank you. You may not be able to park both cars in front of your house, but that seems to be a tremendous virtue. So it seems, in hindsight, remarkably obvious that this is a logical way to develop a site. And this, by the way, I think is the sort of development that will probably be happening in Princeton at the same distance from the epicenter of Princeton as this was in Metuchen. One of the things that strike me about this site is that while this is a very busy commercial corridor and the train station is 2 blocks that way, these are like the tree streets in Princeton. So this site had to mediate between the busiest part of town and the quietest part of town. And so one of the things that at the outset of this project, the borough wanted to use a housing type that would blend in. So the scale of the housing you saw is the same scale as a single-family house. The design of the housing was designed on the same principles as a single-family home. It won't stray too far from parking, but one of the key things about this project is that if you look at that box, that is an apartment that goes all the way through. Most apartments, as you know, don't do that. So in this apartment, the front of the apartment is the living room, the back of the apartment is the bedrooms. It's a 2-story apartment building. Every one of those front porches, has 2 doors on it. One door leads to apartment upstairs and one leads to apartment at the first level. Yes?
How big was the site?
Almost 6 acres.
6 acres?
Almost 6 acres. And there are 105 units on 6 acres, and density is about 18 units per acre. So, back to the site plan for a moment. So the key takeaways here is that to succeed in developing a community in which parking disappears, which is really the essence of what this community is. The parking is all in plain sight because it's on the streets in front of you, but you're not really aware of the parking because we tend not to see parked cars. The key to doing that was to crank the layout of the roads to an extreme degree so that there's a huge amount of road frontage in a relatively tiny community. For me, one of the niftiest takeaways is that space, which is basically a parking lot. It looks like a park, and it feels like a park, but it's actually a parking lot. And this project was a great awakening for me because I realized I focused on the relationship between parking lots and streets. And you know, for the first time in this project, I realized that, so there's that parking lot. There's the curb, there's one lane, there's a 30-foot cartway, there's a 30-foot park, and then another 30-foot cartway on the other side. So it looks and feels like a park. There you go. That was the original design of that space. A 30-foot road, a 30-foot road, and then a 30-foot strip of green in the middle. That's what it actually looked like. One of those rare, yes?
How would you compare that to the old hospital site?
Well, it's similar in that it has the same proximity to the center of town. It's similar in that it has a similar scale of housing type. It's very different in terms of the density. And different in terms, well, I suspect your question had a thought, a specific thought behind it?
Yeah, just to know how you would compare the differences between something like that and the hospital site as it would apply to Princeton. Because we do have some communities that have accomplished that in town.
Well, I have lots of thoughts about that. I'll try to give a really brief version of them. I think that the hospital site illustrates a problem that the community, both Metuchen and Princeton were trying to solve, which is that how do you put a bunch of relatively denser housing than the existing neighborhood right in the middle of an existing neighborhood. And the hospital showed one way to do it. This shows another way to do it. I'm a great believer in when you develop new housing, you should, or new buildings in the middle of an existing residential neighborhood, you should try as best as possible to get like to like. And to the extent to which that you can't, that's the art of design. Because in design, you're really trying to fool the eye. And lots of times you have things that aren't so. You have to make it feel as right to people as possible. That also is a longer subject. Yes?
I just want to know, what about the housing that the university did on 206? That seems to mirror in a lot of ways
Yes.
the solution to parking, because it seems all on street within the community.
Yes. I think that's a really good example of that. That one whose name escapes me at the moment.
Berwick Samard.
Thank you. I think that's a great example of how to fit new residential development into an existing residential community. Ironically, it's not cheek to jowl quite as much as the hospital site is with residential. I'm personally much more fond of what was done at the Berwick site. I think, though, they could have accomplished the same results and gotten more housing on that site without diminishing what they accomplished. And one of the reasons one of the first things I'd say is that I think that as our communities grow, I think there's a need to always find ways to get more housing because our communities will grow, and our amount of land is finite, so we have to find ways to get the most utility out of it without compromising quality of life. Yes?
The green space with the trees in the middle, is that used recreationally much, or
Yes,
is it essentially
yes,
shade
it is.
trees? How is it, or is it essentially shade trees? How long is it, and how much recreation actually? What kind of recreation happens there?
The recreation is very passive. This space is about 400 feet long. The space is about 30 feet wide. So it's definitely passive recreation. There's pathway, there's benches. It's not meant for any form of active recreation.
Is there much running, neighbors running around doing their jogging? Anywhere,
Uh,
in the whole development?
There's no more here than there is elsewhere. It's, like Princeton, it's a relatively low, relaxed community in which it's safe to bicycle and drive pretty much anywhere. So the community certainly lends itself to that. And in that, I'd say it's pretty successful because most communities of this type don't have a piece of ground like that in the middle. For older people, it certainly works. And for very much younger people, it's a great place to just hang out because it has great sun.
So there is or there isn't jogging in the streets?
Well, there are no dedicated jogging ways.
I just wonder whether people do it because it's enclosed and there are trees and it's local. No.
Well, you saw it from the photographs. It's very inviting to pedestrians, more so than most places. Yes.
Can I ask about street maintenance, because the on-street parking is a feature that's
Yes.
been designed in. The borough is responsible for
Yes.
snow removal and things
These are
like
public
that?
streets. They were designed to public standards.
designed-
And they were dedicated to borough
And
protection.
how does that work? If parking is allowed during snowstorms and...
Yes, the same way that parking works,
Well, there are signs in parts of Princeton that say
yes.
no on-site park or no on-street parking.
Yes,
there's
people are not compelled to leave during snowstorms. It's, I have to confess, in the 15 years since I did this, I don't remember what the current state of the art is, but essentially most places, you're not compelled to remove your cars from the street. That is one of the key issues in reliance on on-street parking in our part of the world.
But sometimes it's alternate side of the streets on different days,
Yes.
so that
No,
the
it's
place
not-
can be
it's
clean,
not-
but
it's
these
not-
are both
it's not that way
sides
there.
all the time.
Right, it's not that
Yeah.
way there. You had a question about the light?
This may be off topic, but do the buildings have handicap access in the back entrance?
They do not. This community, for better or worse, was designed and did not make a barrier-free access a significant priority. Yes.
You said that this was 105 units and 15 were affordable. Did the developer get a special waiver to not have to have 20% of them be affordable units?
This was done in a different regulatory regime. The requirement to do 15% or 20% in those days was variable to some extent. These were done as rentals, and so oftentimes in rental communities, the 20%, which seems we think of as carved in stone, is oftentimes reduced to 15%. I'm sorry, I misspoke. This is not a rental. In this community, the number of affordable units was determined by the borough, who, as I mentioned earlier, initiated this project. So the borough had a vision for what they wanted to accomplish. And through the course of setting the development criteria for the project, the developer and the borough jointly agreed on this number. And it was somehow, it worked in the context of what the borough's requirements were during the 1990s. Yes?
When you planned this site, did you have to, before building, did you have to tear down buildings before you put up these residences? Was there a zoning change?
There was only one building on the site, which was a 100-year-old school, which was beautiful, which the community had actually tried to save a few years earlier. They had an RFP, they brought in developers' waste. And so 5 or 10 years later, the property ended up being back in the hands of the borough. They again issued an RFP. The first RFP, the requirement was to save the building and repurpose it. The second RFP, the one to which my partners and I responded to, the borough accepted the reality that there was no way to save the building, and so the building was taken down as part of the process. Yes?
Could you possibly steer this conversation back to the recent,
Yes.
the topic at hand?
Yes, be glad to. So, back to Berkeley. It's hard to see in some of these slides. The site was designed to facilitate the movement of cars, and one of my beliefs is that walkability, design for walkability, design for parking are integral. So to the extent to which you want to have, in the interest of quality of life, you want a high degree, you want a high degree of walkability. You need to get all the cars where you want them. To get a great community, you need to find ways to make the cars happy and make the people happy too. And that's really that's why I started talking about this project, because in this community, all those goals seem to fit together better than in most instances. So for example, this is there's a 400-foot long building alongside that 400-foot long park. There's parking lots on either side of that building. It's a big obstacle to have people walk around a 400 long foot building to get to their parking. So we made a pass-through through that building in order to make it easier for both pedestrians and for automobiles. And that is at this scale of development, which is a great scale for great scale and great intensity of development for sites that are just beyond the town center of towns like Princeton and Metuchen. Coincidentally, the borough of Princeton, as it was, and the borough of Metuchen are both exactly the same size. They're both 2 square miles. They have a great deal in common. And a lot of what we did here was informed by my experience as a resident. But the idea, all the ideas here were to serve the needs that you had to serve, and to do it in place to enhance the quality of life. So for example, here's a view of one of the 5 dispersed parking lots. In order to make parking lots less visually oppressive, we closed down the view of the parking lot. The parking lot is 64 feet wide, 24-foot aisle, 18-foot parking spot, 18-foot parking spot. As you walk along the small scale of the streets here, we didn't want a 64-foot view of a parking lot, so the 2 18-foot aisles are shielded by the 2 tiny buildings that you see here. One on the left is a little parking garage. For people who wanted to pay a few dollars extra, they could get a private little garage. There's a few of them in the community. The building on the right is what became known as a trash temple. You probably noticed the absence of dumpsters in all the photographs. Didn't edit them out or choose not to photograph the dumpsters. There are no dumpsters. This community, there are little buildings exactly the size of that 1-car garage, and this one, 2 matching buildings. This one is for a car, this one is for garbage cans. There's 5 such buildings around the community, so nobody has to walk very far to take their trash. Those buildings are also where the mailboxes are located in a way that's weather sheltered. So to pull us back to parking, one of the things that we learned in this is that when you're designing the parking, you're also designing the rest of the community. And you're trying to find ways, ideally, to layer on all these other issues onto the design of the parking so that everything fits together. So there's a view inside that same parking lot looking out. The freestanding parking garage is just outside there. That's the trash temple. Across the street there's another parking lot, and that's another trash temple. So this is probably the view on the entire site where you can see parking lots the most, which I did on purpose to emphasize that there really are parking lots there, but they're very hard to notice. That's the side of Trash Temple with the mailbox and the weather shelter on top of it. So, 1 or 2 more quick takeaways on this. I'll get your question in just 1 second. When we did this community, this was the first study that we did. And the reason this project went forward is because everyone loved this image of what to do. This was an image of what the project should look like at the principal road intersection of County Road and Route 27. And everybody loved that, and they said, yeah, do this project, it'll be great. You totally understand our town. And this was another early view. One of the requests from the community was to put a park at the one corner of the site, and the part of the site closest to the downtown. And they said, yeah, you totally understand our community, let's do this project. That's what that corner ended up looking like. That's the site plan we've been talking about. This is the first site plan that we did in 1997. You see this plan? You see this plan? At the time, I thought I was reasonably smart. All this stuff here, we totally nailed the first go around, and the community loved it, the developer loved it, and everything worked. But the price of it was this enormous, ugly parking lot in the middle. And the community said to me, you know, we really like those watercolors, and we love the way you totally understand what our streets are about, but we really don't like that very much. And in my infinite wisdom, my reply to them was, well, that's the price you pay for this great stuff on the outside. That's the way it has to be. And I'm embarrassed to this day that I actually said that. Because it actually, they forced me to reconsider other approaches. A little truth in advertising. Someone over there had a question that I ignored from. Yes?
Yeah, I think your design is beautiful. I think it's lovely. My question is, though, is there a 6-acre property that we're going to put it on in the borough of Princeton? I mean, I don't really understand.
Well,
We're not actually suggesting this project get built in Princeton.
the-
We're showing the
the-
examples of how other communities, so it could happen on a 3-acre site, a 2-acre site. I'm just looking at the strategy of, this was the standard reigning idea of design, put an enormous parking lot in the back and line the edge with buildings. So we're not really suggesting that this be directly applied to an existing site in Princeton.
So in other words, it's not going to be behind the Spring Street parking lot and the record exchange in that area? Or
Correct.
would it be?
As a, there actually was a 6-acre site, just like this in Princeton, which was the Berwick site. And lots of times, these pieces of ground are hiding in plain sight in our communities. One day we'll wake up and find that someone has thought to repurpose a piece of ground that we just assumed was going to stay that way forever. So it may not be 6 acres, or it might be 6 acres. It might be 2 acres or 3 acres. But what's interesting about this is the approach to take at a very modest density, at the density of single-family homes and at the scale of single-family homes, what ideas can we use to grow our communities as they inevitably will. Yes?
Has anyone given thought to the firehouse on Chestnut Street?
Yes.
What was the
You
question?
can say nothing more? Has
Well, you
any
just
thought-
asked if people have given thought, and I just said yes. People have given lots of thought to it. I wouldn't say they've given any action, but there's been a lot of thought.
In the back.
You started with a blank canvas essentially for this project. Is there some reason you didn't consider a 2-car parking garage internal to each unit?
Yes. But that's a longer conversation. We did consider it, and we decided to go in a different direction. It's a long, I mean, the real answer to your question is long and complicated. At the time when the borough issued an RFP to developers to proceed with this project, other developers in fact did propose that. And one of the things that the borough did not like was the visual impact of all those garage doors. And one of the things that they liked about this was the fact that they accepted the reality that cars parked on streets had certain issues, but they liked the idea that as you walk in this community, what you saw was a sort of normal, happy place that felt like single-family homes. And so it was a trade-off that people made.
And the value to urban planning is that it puts all the residents on the sidewalk in civic engagement with their neighbors throughout the course of the day going to their car, as opposed to letting you hop into your car in a little isolated room, pop open a door, drive out, and never say hello to your neighbor or anything like that.
Right. One other thing to keep in mind is that the context for this is what's happening in this part of the housing market in New Jersey. And the standard housing type that the market supplies for that type of housing are 2-story apartments with a sea of parking lots. So there are places that do have garages. Those are typically different, it's a different market at a different price point. At this price point, what the market primarily provides are 2-story wood frame buildings with huge parking lots. So this was essentially was an attempt to say, well, in that universe, there's probably a better way or another way to do it that might promote a higher visual urban design pattern. Yes?
I was just going to mention that in terms of places where we might see some development, the Butler tract, I would expect would, which is owned by the university, but did previously have 300 housing units on it, and I know that, you know, at some point down the road they are interested in developing that.
Yes.
Also Lower Alexander, people may not realize that the university owns all the property from the train station down to the, you know, to the canal, I think with the exception of one piece of property, and they're interested in redeveloping that. So probably the plan was pre-consolidation for that to be residential mixed use.
Your points are very well taken. One of the things I'm always amazed at when a new project comes along is, where did that site come from? It's like, it's been, and the answer is that, like those sites, they've been hiding in plain sight for a long time. I want to change gears and talk about different building type, more of the nature of what you might find closer to the very center of Princeton. So this is a project in Rahway, very different situation. This photograph is taken standing on the train platform in Rahway. Rahway is a town of about 27,000 people. It has the 4th busiest train station in New Jersey. And the community is called Park Square. That's how close it is to the train platform. This was the first modern redevelopment done in Rahway. Quick frame of reference for Rahway. 27,000 people, bounded by all these highways. 2 rail lines converge in Rahway, the Shore Line and the main line of Amtrak and New Jersey Transit. As a result, Rahway has phenomenal train service. Before there were cutbacks, there were 60 trains every day to New York stopping in Rahway, and 60 trains every day from New York stopping in Rahway. So it's phenomenally well transit. This site also is hiding in plain sight. It's a 2.5-acre block right in the center of town, a block or 2 from the train station. For a variety of reasons, though redevelopment started to happen in New Jersey in town centers in the 90s, everyone kicked the tires in Rahway and went the other way. And after my partners and I did the project in Metuchen, we wanted to do something more urban, and Rahway came along, and that was the next project that we did. The short take is that on these 2.5 acres, we built 2 buildings, 159 apartments. The basic building type is a parking at grade level, and then 3 or 4, one building has 3 levels of housing on top, and one has 4 levels of housing on top. So very similar to Jack Morrison's building on Spring Street, very similar to several other projects that have happened in Princeton. In Rahway, as a result of a variety of factors, Rahway has managed to build close to 1,000 housing units over the last 20 years in its core downtown, after almost no activity of this type at all. And there's another 2,000 housing units in the pipeline, either under construction, about to begin, or in the approval process.
So Joel, quickly, their residence numbers have gone from 27,000 to...
It hasn't resulted in a significant increase in population because of larger scale demographics, right? So more people are living downtown than ever did, but housing, family patterns and the number of people living in households further away from downtown has gone down. So the population has tended to stay stable. What's significant, though, is because the increased number of people living downtown, you remember your frame of reference is not Princeton. Because there are more people living downtown, Rahway has really blossomed as a center for restaurants and other things, and the downtown has really started to grow. I'm going to zip through a bunch of photos about this. Feel free to interrupt me, and then we'll talk about what are the takeaways from this. So on this site, okay, 2.5 acres, originally one single block, roughly 300 by 300. And we built 2 buildings. The smaller of the 2 was the first one. It has parking at grade and 3 floors of housing on top. This one has parking at grade and has another parking level below that. One of the key takeaways that I learned from this project is that the Rahway River is right behind those buildings. The elevation of this street is about 4 feet higher than that street. It took me an amazing long time to realize what that meant in cosmic significance, which is that this street was already 4 feet lower than this parking lot was going to be. This is a ramp down to a lower parking level. And wherever you have sites that have differential in grade like that, it's a tremendous opportunity to capture a great deal more parking at a very economical cost by taking advantage of topography.
basically the whole of the north side of Nassau Street going east is that way.
It's a great opportunity.
You could easily put a platform
It's a
with
tremendous opportunity,
property
yes,
on top.
yes. It's one of the things that you should always be looking for.
Yeah,
The key concept, so there you saw the typical residential layout. Here you see the conditions at grade. The first building fronts on Irving Street, which is, in this part of town, is Rahway's Nassau Street. It's the principal mercantile street in town. So the issue here was that putting a parking garage on Nassau Street would have been an inappropriate thing to do because it would have really deadened Nassau Street. So for this building, we hid that parking lot with a 20-foot layer of retail space, not unlike what was done at the Spring Street garage. It takes a while to figure out. Those things seem incredibly obvious in hindsight, but it takes a while in most communities and most developers to realize that that's an important thing to do. This being a private project rather than a public project, there are private consequences for money that affect decisions like that. You can see this building is skinnier than this building. One of the consequences to putting the liner of retail space in front of that building is that this building grows to 85 feet in depth, which it doesn't need to be. By an amazing coincidence, parking lots are 64 feet deep, and by an amazing coincidence, most apartment buildings are 64 feet deep, which makes it a perfect marriage to put a building on top of a parking lot. And it's an important determinant of housing building form for residential in downtown projects. The fact that parking lot and a building typology, central hallway, the width of that hallway is 6 feet, the depth of those apartments approximately 30 feet. It's a very happy marriage. This is a great solution, but this makes huge demands on the design of the project because now you have to deal with a building that's 85 feet deep. This is the center of town. That's what the site looked like about 30 years ago. You can see how close the railroad is. There's the railroad river. Now we'll walk through the project. That's a view on Irving Street, the principal mercantile street in town. We'll back up for 1 second. This view and that view are in the center of the block. In the design of this community, we made a decision early on. We took a leaf from the Metuchen project. We said, this block is so big, what are we going to do with the center of this block? We could have left it green space, but we felt that there was a need to create, just to address the parking issues in a way that a new street in the center of the site would be helpful. And we weighed the value of a sealed off green space, sealed off from the outside community that only the residents can enjoy, or the advantage of putting a street in the center of this block and breaking the block into two. The wiser course seemed to do that. Among the significant benefits to that were all 4 of the 5 parking garage entrances are off this street. So we did not have to degrade this street at all with the presence of parking garages. There are 16 cars parked. There are 16 metered parking spaces on that street. The street's actually a private street. We told the parking authority that they can put meters on it and they could collect and keep the money. One of the reasons we did that is that when people show up to rent an apartment, the rental office is right there. So we wanted people to always be able to pull in, find a parking spot, and come in and have their appointment and be able to rent their apartment. So the advantages of doing that were they made the cars happier, they made the prospective tenants happier, they also made pedestrians happier. We also found that by the design of that space, there were things we could do that could add to the community and to sort of create social spaces of a type that did not exist previously in this area, or certainly in this type of housing. So, back to walking around this community. One of the issues, earlier I said that in looking at a project like this, it's worthwhile to look at both what does it look and feel like today, and what can we learn from that, and also what problems were people trying to solve at that time. At that time, no one had built a project like this in Rahway. Before we came to Rahway, a housing study had been done by the city to see who was living in Rahway and why. And this ultimately relates to parking. Merck was started a 5-minute walk from this site by the nephew of the Merck guys from Germany who sent their nephew here in the mid-19th century to find a place to build a factory. Well, they built that factory right near here. And though Merck has grown to something that looks more like Stanford than Rahway, the housing study found that over a 20-year period, virtually no one above the level of janitor who had been moved into Merck was constantly cycling people in and out of that facility. No one chose to live in Rahway above the level of janitor for almost 20 years. And one of the things that said to us was, if we want to have people live in downtown Rahway, one of the questions we had to ask ourselves were, why would a single woman want to rent here? And what would make her say yes and what would make her say no? And we came to the conclusion that it was essential to have secure on-premises parking, integral to the building. And if we didn't do that, we thought we were going to run a significant risk of not having a successful project. And so virtually everything about this project derived from that decision, a decision made approximately year 2000, 2001, when there had been no redevelopment of any kind in Rahway. And even though there were plans afoot to build a 500-space municipal garage 2 blocks from here, we felt that our project could not assume that our market would want to walk 2 or 3 blocks to a large municipal garage and park there and then walk to this community. So in this community, so the design of this community, the key decision was how we're going to deal with parking, how much parking should we provide. There were absolutely no benchmarks at that time for what to do. The standard wisdom was to provide 2 parking spaces per unit. That would have been 300 cars, a huge number of cars at tremendous cost. We were like thinking, we can't possibly do that. How can that work? In the end, we provided parking at a ratio of 1.3 spaces per unit in the parking garages. And it turned out, after all was said and done, and this project was built and other projects like it followed, it turns out that parking demand is about 1 space per unit. Over the 15 years since, I've come to the conclusion that in most communities, whether it's Rahway, whether it's Princeton, if you have a community with a decent degree of walkability and a decent degree of access to transit, that a good baseline to start your design thinking off and planning is 1 space per unit. It could easily become less. It could easily be more. But the conventional wisdom that projects like this should have parking ratios in the range of 1.5 or more, I take issue with. Yes?
You know, one of the recommendations of the consultants who just completed the parking study for Princeton was that parking provided by private property owners, you know, is often empty at certain times of the day, and that a good way to meet the overall parking needs of the community is to somehow give public access to those private lots. And I'm curious, you know, in this scenario, are those parking lots empty during the day when people are off at their jobs? And can you imagine a scenario in which those spaces would be made available?
That's a great question. It touches on a whole slew of different issues. One is a temporal one, which is that in communities like this that are very accessible to transit, very close to New York, demographics are changing so much that when this community was first leasing up, you had a lot of people were living there who worked in Piscataway. There's no way to get from Rahway to Piscataway except by a car. So in the early days, the garages would empty out as people drove to their jobs in Piscataway and elsewhere. As time went by and more people heard about this community, people who would otherwise live in Hoboken or Jersey City said, I can ride 20 more minutes a day on the train, and my rent will be way less, I'm gonna live in Rahway, right? So their cars, they had less cars, and their car tended to stay in the garage all day. So one answer for a place like this is that it's a very dynamic market because the community is changing. A place like Princeton, where the community is much more stable, it's possible to look at a question like that in a different way. It's also different in the following sense, which is that in Rahway, the first community of this type, the key was that the parking be absolutely secure. So once you start to let the public into a garage like that, you lose the level of security. It's a different set of issues in Princeton. And in Princeton, so you have two other ways to look at it. One is that we feel that the community is safe enough, then the developer may consider allowing strangers to come into the parking garage. Alternatively, if the topography results in a parking garage at different levels, or if the site design allows the parking garage to actually be made into several separate parking garages, it's possible to design it to say, okay, this part of the parking garage, these 50 spaces, we're going to allow access to the public maybe when it becomes available. Another set of issues in a place like Princeton is that where physical safety is not an issue the way it was 20 years ago in Rahway. When my partners and I first went to see this site, there was a bank. That bank building, which I think is right there, we went to look at the site, and while we were standing there looking at that site, that bank was held up. Like we were just walking around the site, and when we came back, we said, what's all the yellow tape there? Now, that's not cast aspersions on why they don't have bank robbers, they're terribly involved. But it was a very, it was a wake-up call for us on dealing with this issue. In Princeton, so in Rahway, you had the security issue that you don't have in Princeton. What that means going forward is that in Princeton, you can build a project like this without having parking at all. And we've seen that those projects work because we're not worried about that. So there are a lot of different options in Princeton for dealing with that. So you don't have to have this captive and potentially wasted resource not being utilized well. Interestingly, Princeton was also the model for the development of this community in many ways, in that the design of Palmer Square, the idea of creating a modern steel frame building but making it look like it had been built at the same time as Williamsburg, by artfully slicing and dicing the building so it looked like a series of salami slices built over time, had a huge impact on me. And this was the first time that I had tested out that idea. In Metuchen, I came very close to wanting to do that, and in the end, I'm grateful that I chose not to, do that potential excursion into Disney World. At Park Square, because we were right on the downtown, and across the street were actual real buildings that had been built on lots created 200 years ago as separate buildings, we followed that pattern, and it turned out to be a good one. So Princeton has a lot to do with this community. And the Palmer Square actually generated the ideas that resulted in that rendering. That was another one of those renderings where the locals saw it, we saw it, everyone said, wow, this is great, we want that. And then the trick became, how do you capture that and then solve all these other issues, most of which ended up relating to parking. One of the things that's interesting about both of these communities, it relates ultimately to parking in the following sense. If you take the parking issue seriously, and you marry those to the inevitable issues of development and dollars and cents that you have to deal with, you end up with a project in which the form and the site plan, the layout of roads and paths, and the footprints of buildings are driven by parking considerations. Another one of your considerations is the quality of life, then you face the following dilemma. You lay out the buildings and the site in a way that shapes the buildings in ways that promote good urban design. Then when you go to lay out apartments in those buildings, you find that, well, those buildings don't really have terribly regular shapes. And so the result is, these are pages from the brochure of Park Square. You can see that while there are nice rectilinear floor plans, there are many floor plans that are anything but. because the exigencies of the site, really, we followed the same guidance in both of these projects, which is that the urban design considerations were the card that trumped everything else. And when it came time to design the housing, we said, we'll just find ways to make the housing work. It's pretty easy to make a habitat where people will be comfortable living in almost any shape. The problem is, how do you do it economically? And inevitably, when you build apartments that have shapes like this, and when you build a project of this size, where there are this many different footprints, it ends up costing somebody something. But at the end of it, and this is ultimately a public policy decision, because shaping the building and the site for the advantage of the public is something, that's what municipal government and municipal decision-making is all about. If there's a price to be paid by the private entity doing this project, well, sometimes the developers just want to do it because they think that's the right thing to do. Sometimes they want to do it because they think that's how they make the most money. Most developers do not think that. And so if it turns out to be beneficial to the community to have a project that needs all these different shaped footprints of apartments, and if the community really believes in that, and the developer believes that that's a bad thing to do from his bottom line, then that's something that's worth having a conversation with, in which basically the public and the private pieces say, well, how can we make you whole? Because we think that doing that will lead to good things for our community. Two other things, I'm sorry.
Are you taking into consideration also services like Lyft and Uber and driverless cars that maybe you won't have the need for parking at every house?
It's a very, very dynamic marketplace, and things change so fast. I mean, in 15 years, the dialogue, even in Rahway, has changed from, well, we're never going to be able to rent an apartment if this garage is not totally safe, to where, wow, this person's not even going to have a car, and they're going to walk everywhere. So the answer is yes. The projects that we're designing now, we take that into consideration. The projects that are going through approvals now, the municipality, the planning board, looks at those and says, well, what can you do that will reduce parking demand in return for your request to have less parking? It's probably a good point to pause and say that in Rahway, they have, at the time we did Park Square, no one knew what the parking should be. The city of Rahway basically said, we're open to what you think will work because we want this project to happen, because no one's built a project like this in our town. And so they were very flexible with this. Since that time, they've developed the following standards. A project like Park Square today would have a parking obligation of 1.25 parking spaces per apartment to be provided by the project. Of those 1.25, 1.0 have to be on site. The 0.25 that you could elect not to provide on site, you could provide on the street, you could provide in a parking lot, you could provide off-site on some other ways. But to the extent to which, if you don't provide them, then you have to basically pay, do a pilot and pay the parking authority for those up to 0.25 parking spaces that you're not providing. The parking authority takes that money and they use that to enhance parking around the city. That's a long answer to your question. Yes?
Thank you for your, it's very interesting. In helping them to plan for development, would there be any value to measuring the square footage in revenue producing sites versus non-revenue producing sites? That would include property owners as well as the municipality.
When you say revenue producing sites, in what sense?
Well, the parking meters produce revenue for the municipality. Buildings, restaurants, all kinds of buildings which are taxed produce revenue for the municipality. The municipality doesn't have any property except the parking meters and the garages that produce revenue.
Mm-hmm.
So there must be some kind of a ratio between the amount of space available so that you can get some kind of a balance between revenue producing and non-revenue producing. Parking lots don't normally produce revenue.
Well, they produce revenue for the I mean, if they're available to the general public, they do. I'm not sure if I'm following your question. In projects of this type, if a project like this one, not everyone has a car, and so people will actually pay as part of their lease, if they want a parking spot or 2 parking spots if they need it, they pay a fee. They rent those parking spots from the landlord. So there's a revenue produced if they, is that what you were asking about? Or I missed your point?
Well, it's all about space. I talked to the consultants, he says the whole thing is about space. The space either produces revenue or it doesn't produce revenue.
Right.
I'm talking about money.
Yes, parking spaces in communities of this type do produce revenue.
The money for the town is significant as opposed to the landlord or the developer.
No.
Yeah, but they pay taxes, so.
Yes, so say exactly, all these projects eventually are producing revenue for municipalities. To the extent to which they're successful and are more valuable, they pay higher taxes. Just like the restaurant is paying, right, the more valuable the restaurant, the more they're paying in taxes. So did I answer your question? Or not?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
So the parking spaces that are made available by the builder or the manager are not automatic to the apartment owner. They have to be paid extra by the apartment owner. Is that always the case?
Nowadays, yes. It varies from place to place, but almost all projects of this type, the housing rent and the parking rent are decoupled from each other for the simple reason that, as an example of Lyft, some people just choose not to have a car. Other people, because of where they work, may have 2 cars.
So in the case of low-income housing or affordable housing, if there is an apartment with parking space allotted, do they pay extra for the parking space also?
Avalon Bay, I believe they do.
I
believe at Avalon Bay, even the affordable units, they have to pay if they want a parking space.
I think that,
No, they don't.
I think that
They have to pay. Avalon Bay charges a separate fee for parking.
Right.
For everyone, it's the same fee.
Yeah.
It affects people differently, but it's the same fee.
in most communities of this type, people decouple the parking and charge for it for the simple reason that if you don't, the landlord philosophy, if you don't charge people for it, they don't appreciate it. The issue of affordable housing is such that it affects what people are paying for their parking, affects what they're able to pay for their rent, which is subject to a whole bunch of very complicated calculations. But as a principle, developers almost always try to monetize this. It's in a place like Princeton, there are different issues than say a place like Rahway. The first projects that were built in Rahway, developers could not charge as much, charge very, very low rents for their parking, because they were in the bind of they had to have the parking, but the market was not yet willing to pay market rates for the for the privilege of parking in their parking garage. A related issue that I wanted to touch on that is well, I might not touch on it. It seems to be stalled. Bear with me. This is the, you remember in the plan of Park Square, we took the block, we ran a street through it, a little circle in the middle of the block. This is that space at night when there was a citywide festival called Culture Crawl. This was about 5 years ago. In that space, a band shell was set up and a concert was held in that space. And one of the things that since occurred to me, since designing this project, is that's a really important thing to layer onto projects of this type. So here you are, normally cars, where that band is performing, their parking garage door there and directly opposite. These kind of spaces can be designed so that when they're not needed for their primary purpose of vehicular access can become great community centers, both for the residents and for the larger city. The street that was put through that big block is privately owned, but it was designed and built to look, feel, and smell like a public street, even down to the presence of meters, so that the public would feel like a sense of ownership, that the civic environment, the civic infrastructure was improved by the construction of the project. So, I'll end with just a few more slides. In Rahway, we made exactly the same stupid mistake that we made in the beginning of Metuchen, which is that we nailed this vision early on, but this is what the design of that community looked like in early stages. Totally did not understand what we were doing. And it took a long time to realize that the subtle differences between these layouts and what we ended up with make all the difference in terms of the quality of the civic realm that we were creating in building that new street. It's amazing how long it takes to figure out how to do it more or less right. Great. I'm going to show you two of the projects really quickly. This is a project 2 blocks from Park Square that was designed for a different development, but a very similar set of issues. This site is about 2 acres. It's actually part of a much larger site, almost 4 acres, that had been a municipal parking lot. Almost all of this was a combination of municipal and private parking lots. And on this site, everyone in Rahway is a whole lot smarter. So on this site, we basically took, this is the main line of Amtrak. It's probably too light for you to see what's going on, and I apologize. The short take here is that everyone, including the city and the developer and everyone, was smart enough to where when we did this project, instead of building it 66 units to the acre, this project is 100 units to the acre. It just broke ground on it. And we basically took a large site in the center of town, ran a street through it, because this was one big block that was like an obstacle for cars to get around and people to get around. So there was a street here, Monroe Street, which ended in a T with Main Street, which you can barely see. Took a long time to figure out that the logical thing to do was to run that street through, which created 2 separate building sites. The site, being reasonably close to the river, also has a slight change in topography. And so this has the same program as Park Square. This is the plan at grade level. The blue is parking garage. The pink are liner retail on Main Street. In this part of Rahway, Main Street is Main Street, so we didn't want the parking garage to be visible. This is the lower level, accessed from the lowest topographical part of the property, so we can just shoehorn in a second parking level beneath the at-grade level, and then there's the housing on top. So this is, that's the facade on Main Street. There's looking at the new street running, bisecting a formerly unnecessarily large block. So this has 208 apartments on a 2-acre site. And then this site is a block away from that. This is Park Square. This is the site I just showed you. This is Monroe Street. Monroe Street used to cross the river and end in a T at Main Street. The project I showed you a moment ago is called Main and Monroe. And in that project, we ran this street through there to create new frontage, to increase walkability, and to accomplish something else, which I can't resist mentioning, which is that all the projects that I've worked on, nobody lives with a view of a parking lot or dumpsters or anything like that. In this town, in these situations, what seemed to be the right move to me was to bisect blocks which were too large. That's a value judgment. In my view, they were unnecessarily large for what was socially desirable. And the result is that more frontage was created. So everyone who walks along those new sites, whether it's Park Square, whether it's Main and Monroe, you're always seeing the front of a building. If you live in that building, your view is always a street. And my personal ideal for a street is the streets here in Princeton, the streets in Metuchen. So everyone who lives there has a heightened experience of public space on the public street, and a great deal of attention is paid to detail those streets. So it increases the quality of life for people inside and outside the buildings. This site, adjacent to the Rahway River, is the developable part of the site is 2 acres of a 3-acre block. Yes?
Oh,
Yes.
my question is this all rental development we're talking about? Is it all rental development we're talking about?
Yes, it is.
So there's no chance for people to come in, condos, townhouses, young people to start buying in?
The market which is most supportive of young people today is the rental.
Because they can't afford anything else.
Exactly right.
So how about condos, townhouses to bring young people into town to start?
The economics of places like this for ownership forms of housing, like condominiums, is such that the price points are very difficult for young people to afford. So in community, there are townhouse projects in Rahway, but they tend not to attract starter level, entry level housing.
But Robbinsville is a perfect example of how townhouses and condos for young and old are very popular and very successful.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Well, one of the issues in town centers is that Robbinsville is not a town center, though it is a town center, and it builds itself as such. In places like Rahway and downtown Princeton, land is such at a phenomenally high premium that there simply isn't the room to do townhouse type development unless one is willing to trade off the possibility of having townhouse development, but just having a whole lot less housing units. For places like Rahway, at least, and I think for central Princeton, I think the more important value is to get more people living in the center of town.
And then who's going to pay for more schools and other places going for taxes going?